The radar warning screamed. Captain Mitchell's voice cracked over the radio. Break right! Break right! Multiple bandits. 8, no, 10 contacts inbound. Missile lock. I'm hit. I'm... Static. Then chaos. The four-ship formation of F-15 Eagles scattered as enemy fighters swarmed from above like wolves on sheep, their missiles streaking through the sky, leaving white contrails of death. Lieutenant Jackson's fighter exploded in a fireball at 25,000 feet. Captain Rodriguez was diving hard, 2 enemy fighters on his tail, his defensive flares burning bright but ineffective against the newer missiles tracking him. The ambush was perfect, coordinated, devastating. The American squadron was being slaughtered in the skies over the Black Sea, and nobody at command had seen it coming. But 40,000 feet above the carnage, flying combat air patrol in an F-22 Raptor that everyone thought was just routine presence patrol, 24-year-old First Lieutenant Scarlett Hayes watched the ambush unfold and made a decision that would either save her squadron or end her career. She pushed her throttles to full military power, nosed her Raptor in a screaming dive toward the furball below, and keyed her radio. Viper 2-1 engaging. All Eagles, break on my mark. Nobody in the squadron knew that Scarlett had been flying since she was 16, that her father had been a Navy Top Gun instructor, that she'd logged over 2,000 hours in fighters before even joining the Air Force, that she'd scored perfect marks in every air combat simulation, or that the quiet, young pilot they'd all dismissed as inexperienced was about to demonstrate why the F-22 Raptor flown by the right pilot could dominate an entire enemy squadron. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, because what happened in the next 12 minutes would become classified legend. First, Lieutenant Scarlett Hayes was 24 years old, youngest pilot in her squadron, with 18 months in the Air Force and only 9 months flying the F-22 Raptor operationally. On paper, she was the least experienced pilot in the formation. 5'5", athletic build, red hair she kept in a regulation bun, green eyes that tracked everything, freckles across her nose that made her look even younger than she was. From Nevada originally, her father had been Lieutenant Commander James Hayes, a legendary Navy FA-18 instructor at Top Gun who died in a training accident when Scarlett was 19. She'd learned to fly in his Cessna at age 12, had her private pilot license at 17, and had been accepted to the Air Force Academy at 18, specifically to become a fighter pilot like him. But what nobody in her current squadron knew, what wasn't in any official record, was that between ages 16 and 20, Scarlett had spent every summer at private aerobatic schools, had competed in international aerobatic competitions under her mother's maiden name, had trained with former Israeli Air Force pilots who taught aggressive dogfighting tactics, and had accumulated flight time and skills that rivaled pilots with 10 years of experience. She'd kept it quiet because she didn't want special treatment, didn't want to be the daughter of James Hayes, didn't want people to assume her skills came from her father's reputation rather than her own work. So when she'd joined the squadron 6 months ago, she'd presented herself as a standard young pilot, followed orders, didn't show off, and let everyone assume she was learning on the job like any other lieutenant fresh from training. The mission had started as routine. 4 F-15 Eagles conducting patrol over international waters near the Black Sea, with Scarlett's F-22 Raptor providing high-altitude combat air patrol as backup. Standard presence mission, the kind they'd flown 100 times. But someone had been watching, planning, waiting. The enemy fighters had come from multiple directions simultaneously, Russian-made Su-35s and Su-57s, advanced fighters with experienced pilots using terrain masking and electronic jamming to avoid early detection until they were already in attack range. The ambush had been perfect. The F-15s never had a chance. Scarlett watched from 40,000 feet as Captain Mitchell's fighter took a missile hit and began trailing smoke in a death spiral. Lieutenant Jackson's aircraft exploded. Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen were running, defensive, 2 enemy fighters on each of them, more fighters moving to cut off their escape. Her training told her to call for help, maintain position, wait for instructions. Her instincts told her that waiting meant watching her squadron die. She made her choice in less than a second. Scarlett pushed her throttles forward, felt the twin Pratt and Whitney engines roar to full military power, and pointed the nose of her F-22 Raptor straight down into a dive that would either save 4 pilots or kill her trying. The F-22 Raptor was the most advanced air superiority fighter in the world, stealth technology that made it nearly invisible to enemy radar, thrust vectoring that allowed impossible maneuvers, weapon systems that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously, and speed and altitude capabilities that gave it advantages over every other fighter in the sky. But technology was only half the equation. The other half was the pilot. And Scarlett Hayes was about to show them what the right pilot could do. She dove through 35,000 feet, the altimeter unwinding rapidly, airspeed climbing towards 600 knots. Her radar showed the tactical situation clearly. 4 friendly fighters running defensive, 10 enemy fighters pursuing or positioning for kills, everything happening in a 3-dimensional box of airspace roughly 10 miles across. She needed to change the geometry. Scarlett selected 2 Su-35s that were pursuing Captain Rodriguez. They were so focused on their target, they hadn't even looked up to see her Raptor diving on them from above. She locked them both with her AN/APG-77 radar, the system tracking both targets simultaneously, calculating intercept solutions. She fired 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs, advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, from 20 miles out, the missiles dropping from her internal weapons bay, motors igniting, accelerating to Mach 4. The Su-35 pilots never knew what hit them. One second they were pursuing an F-15, confident in their numerical advantage. The next second, their radar warning receivers screamed missile lock from an unseen attacker, and then both fighters were tumbling from the sky in pieces. 2 down, 8 to go. Scarlett keyed her radio. "All Eagles, this is Viper 2-1. Break left on my mark. 3, 2, 1, break." Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen broke hard left, trusting the voice on the radio even though they couldn't see who was calling the shots. The 2 Su-35s that had been on Rodriguez immediately lost their tracking solution and had to maneuver to reacquire. That maneuver made them vulnerable. Scarlett had positioned herself perfectly, diving through their altitude, pulling her Raptor into a brutal 7G turn that pressed her into her seat, blood draining from her head as the G-forces tried to black her out. She fought it, breathing in sharp grunts to force blood back to her brain, maintaining consciousness through sheer will. She came out of the turn with 2 more Su-35s in her gunsight picture. Too close for missiles. This would be guns. The M61A, 2 Vulcan 20mm cannon mounted in her Raptor's right wing root, could fire 6,000 rounds per minute. Scarlett didn't need that many. She fired a 3-second burst, approximately 300 rounds, walking her tracers across the first Su-35. The high explosive rounds tore through the fighter's wing root and fuselage. It disintegrated. 3 down. She transitioned immediately to the second fighter, firing another burst. This pilot saw her coming and tried to brake, but he was too slow. Her rounds caught his tail section, shearing off the vertical stabilizer. The Su-35 went into an uncontrolled spin. 4 down, 6 to go. The enemy squadron leader finally realized what was happening, that an unseen American fighter was systematically destroying his formation. He called for his remaining pilots to regroup, to focus on finding and killing whatever was hunting them. But Scarlett had already moved. The F-22's stealth characteristics meant the enemy fighters couldn't get a solid radar lock on her even when they were looking. Their radar would show fleeting contacts, ghosts, nothing they could target reliably. Meanwhile, Scarlett's radar saw them all perfectly. She used her speed and altitude advantage to position above and behind another pair of Su-35s that were trying to flank the fleeing F-15. She came screaming down on them from their blind spot, fired another AMRAAM at point-blank range, less than 5 miles, and the lead fighter exploded before his wingman even knew they were under attack. 5 down. The wingman broke hard, dumping flares and chaff, trying desperately to evade an attacker he couldn't see. Scarlett stayed on him, matching his turn, pulling her Raptor through a maneuver that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. The F-22's thrust vectoring nozzles deflected engine exhaust, helping her turn inside the Su-35's radius. She fired her cannon again. Short burst. The Su-35's canopy shattered, and the fighter nosed over into a dive. 6 down, 4 to go. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, breathless and awed. "Viper 2-1, whoever you are, you just saved my life." Multiple times. Scarlett didn't respond. She was already tracking the next targets. 2 Su-57s, Russia's newest stealth fighters, had broken away from the furball and were trying to position for an attack on the damaged F-15s. These were more dangerous opponents with better situational awareness and more advanced systems, but they still couldn't match the F-22's combination of stealth and performance. Scarlett came at them from an angle they weren't expecting, fired 2 AMRAAMs in rapid succession. The first Su-57 took evasive action, successfully decoying the missile with electronic countermeasures. The second wasn't as lucky. The AMRAAM tracked through his defenses and struck his left engine. The fighter spun away, trailing fire and smoke. 7 down. The remaining Su-57 finally got a brief radar lock on Scarlett's Raptor. Not enough to fire, but enough to know where she was. The pilot was good, experienced, and he immediately turned toward her, trying to close the distance, get into a knife fight where his skills might overcome her technological advantage. Scarlett accepted the challenge. She pointed her nose at him, both fighters closing at a combined speed of over 1,200 knots. This was a merge, the moment when fighters pass each other and the real dogfight begins, where training and skill matter more than technology. They passed within 1,000 feet of each other, both pilots pulling maximum G to reverse direction and get on each other's tail. Scarlett pulled so hard, her G-suit inflated like a blood pressure cuff, squeezing her legs and abdomen to keep blood in her brain. Her vision narrowed to tunnel vision, grayed at the edges, but she maintained consciousness and kept pulling. The two fighters spiraled around each other, each trying to gain the advantage, trading altitude for airspeed, performing maneuvers at the edge of aerodynamic possibility. This was pure dogfighting. The kind of combat that hadn't been common since Vietnam, where missiles and beyond visual range kills had supposedly made close-range maneuvering obsolete. But sometimes you still had to fight with knives. Scarlett used every trick she'd learned from her father, from her aerobatic training, from Israeli instructors who'd fought real dogfights over the Middle East. She used the Raptor's thrust vectoring to execute a Herbst maneuver, pointing her nose away from her direction of travel, letting her aircraft slide sideways through the air while pointing her weapons at the enemy. The Su-57 pilot had never seen anything like it. For a moment, he flew straight across Scarlett's gun sight, presenting a perfect target. She fired. The cannon rounds walked across his fuselage. The Su-57 shuddered, rolled over, and the pilot ejected. 8 down. The remaining 2 enemy fighters, both Su-35s, saw what had happened to their squadron and made the smart choice. They ran, lighting their afterburners and diving for the deck, heading back toward their own airspace at maximum speed. Scarlett let them go. Her mission wasn't to chase fleeing enemies. Her mission was to protect her squadron. She keyed her radio. "All Eagles, this is Viper 2-1. Area clear. Proceed to Rally Point Delta for damage assessment." Captain Rodriguez responded immediately. "Viper 2-1, we're showing 4 remaining fighters from our formation. Lieutenant Jackson is down. Captain Mitchell ejected, but his beacon is active. The rest of us are damaged but flyable." He paused. "Who the hell are you?" "I've never seen flying like that in my life." Scarlett hesitated. Then, "Viper 2-1 is First Lieutenant Scarlett Hayes." "Just doing my job, sir." The radio went silent for several seconds. Then, "Hayes? The new kid? The lieutenant who barely talks in briefings?" "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then Captain Rodriguez's voice came back, and it was different now, respectful, almost reverent. "Lieutenant Hayes, I've been flying fighters for 14 years. I've trained with the best pilots in the world. What you just did, 8 confirmed kills in 12 minutes, most of them while performing impossible maneuvers, saving 4 pilots who were dead to rights." He paused again. "Where the hell did you learn to fly like that?" Scarlett looked out her canopy at the blue sky around her, thought about her father, about all those summers at aerobatic schools, about the hours of training nobody knew about. My dad taught me, sir, and I've had a lot of practice. The debrief at Aviano Air Base in Italy lasted 8 hours. Scarlett sat across from her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the wing commander, Colonel Marcus Johnson, and 2 officers from Air Combat Command who'd flown in specifically to hear her account. The gun camera footage and radar recordings told most of the story. 12 minutes of air combat where Scarlett had engaged 10 enemy fighters, destroyed 8 confirmed, and saved 4 American pilots who would have certainly been killed. Colonel Johnson reviewed the footage for the 3rd time, shaking his head. This maneuver here, where you pointed your nose perpendicular to your velocity vector while maintaining controlled flight, I've never seen anyone execute that in combat. That's pure aerobatic flying applied to air combat. Scarlett nodded. It's called a Herbst maneuver, sir. I learned it at an aerobatic competition in Switzerland 5 years ago. Lieutenant Colonel Chen leaned forward. Lieutenant Hayes, I've reviewed your official file. It shows 2,200 flight hours total, 9 months in the F-22 standard training progression. But what I just watched wasn't standard anything. What's not in your file? Scarlett took a breath. Ma'am, my father was Lieutenant Commander James Hayes, Navy Top Gun instructor. He taught me to fly when I was 12. Between ages 16 and 20, I attended private aerobatic schools in the U.S., Switzerland, and Israel. I competed in international aerobatic competitions under my mother's maiden name, Robertson. I trained with former Israeli Air Force pilots who taught me aggressive dogfighting tactics. By the time I joined the Air Force, I had over 1,500 hours in high-performance aircraft and had won 3 international aerobatic championships. The room was silent. Finally, Colonel Johnson spoke. Why didn't you put this in your file? Why hide that experience? Because I wanted to be judged on my current performance, sir, not my father's reputation. I didn't want people to think I got here because of who my father was. I wanted to prove I belonged based on what I could do now. Chen studied her carefully. And you proved that today. 8 confirmed kills. Perfect tactical decisions, maneuvers I've only seen in airshow performances, executed in combat at 500 knots. Lieutenant Hayes, you didn't just save 4 pilots today. You demonstrated combat capabilities that most pilots never develop in entire careers. One of the Air Combat Command officers spoke up. Lieutenant Hayes, I'm Colonel Patricia Morrison from Air Combat Command. We're going to be recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Your actions today represent one of the most impressive displays of air combat skill in recent history. We're also going to be reviewing your file for immediate assignment to Fighter Weapons School as an instructor. Scarlett's eyes widened. Sir, I'm 24. I've only been operational for 9 months. And you just killed 8 enemy fighters in 12 minutes, most of them more experienced pilots in advanced aircraft. Age and time in service don't matter when you demonstrate this level of capability. The Air Force needs pilots like you training the next generation. Lieutenant Colonel Chen added, There's something else, Hayes. The enemy pilots you engaged today, we've identified 3 of them from wreckage and electronic signatures. They were Russian Air Force elite pilots, not mercenaries or inexperienced fighters. One of them had over 2,000 flight hours and was an instructor at their own fighter weapons school. You defeated pilots who, on paper, should have had every advantage over a 24-year-old lieutenant with 9 months of operational experience. She paused. That tells us that your training, your natural talent, and your decision-making under pressure are exceptional, rare. The kind of capabilities we need to study and replicate across the force. Colonel Morrison pulled out a folder. We're also going to need to debrief you extensively on your training methods, the aerobatic schools, the Israeli Air Force techniques, the competition experience, all of it. If we can identify what made you this effective and incorporate it into our training pipeline, we can develop better fighter pilots across the board. Scarlett felt overwhelmed. 24 hours ago, she'd been the quiet young lieutenant nobody paid much attention to. Now she was sitting in a room with senior officers discussing how to use her experience to reshape fighter pilot training. "Ma'am, sir, I'll help however I can, but I want to make something clear." She looked at each of them. "What happened today wasn't about me being special or talented. It was about preparation, meeting opportunity. My father used to say that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. I'd been preparing my entire life without knowing I'd need those skills today. When the moment came, I was ready." That's what we should be teaching, not specific maneuvers or tactics, but the mindset of constant preparation, of taking every training opportunity seriously, of never assuming you know enough. 3 days later, the surviving members of her squadron gathered for a memorial service for Lieutenant Jackson, whose fighter had been destroyed in the ambush. Afterward, Captain Rodriguez approached Scarlett. "Hayes, can we talk?" They walked to the flight line, where rows of fighters sat gleaming in the Italian sun. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then, "I've been thinking about what happened up there. About how I almost died, how Chen almost died, how we all almost died, because we walked into an ambush we should have seen coming." He looked at her. "And I've been thinking about how you saved us, not just by being a good pilot, but by being willing to make decisions when everyone else was reacting. You would have done the same, sir. Maybe. But you did it, and you did it while flying like some kind of aerial magician." He smiled slightly. "The squadron's been talking. Trying to figure out who you really are. Some people think you're some kind of secret test pilot. Others think you're CIA or something." Scarlett laughed. "I'm just a lieutenant who learned to fly from her dad and spent a lot of time practicing." "Your dad was James Hayes, the Top Gun instructor who wrote half the current ACM manual. You knew?" "I looked it up after the debrief. I remember hearing about him when I was coming up through the ranks. He was a legend. And now I understand why you are what you are." Rodriguez extended his hand. "Thank you for saving my life, and for showing us all what's possible when someone truly masters their aircraft." Scarlett shook his hand. "Thank you for trusting me when I called the break. You didn't know who I was, but you followed the call anyway. That's what we do. Trust our wingmen." He paused. "You're not the quiet new kid anymore, Hayes. After today, you're the pilot everyone's going to want to learn from. That's going to change your life. People are going to treat you differently. Some will resent you for being young and accomplished. Others will put you on a pedestal. Neither reaction is really about who you are. They're about what you represent." "What do I represent?" "Possibility. You represent the idea that age and experience aren't the same thing as capability. That quiet competence can be more valuable than loud confidence. That someone who looks like they don't belong might actually be the most qualified person in the room." He looked back at the fighters on the flight line. "That's a powerful message, but it comes with responsibility. People are going to be watching you now, measuring themselves against you, either trying to emulate you or prove you're not that special. How you handle that attention will matter as much as how you fly." Scarlett nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was saying. She'd spent her entire military career trying to blend in, to avoid standing out, to let her work speak for itself. Now, whether she wanted it or not, she'd become a symbol. The young pilot who'd saved her squadron, the daughter of a legend who'd become a legend herself, the quiet lieutenant who'd revealed capabilities nobody knew existed. "I just want to keep flying and keep getting better," she said finally. "Everything else is noise." Rodriguez smiled. "That's exactly the right attitude. Stay focused on the work, not the recognition. The work is what matters. The recognition is just consequence." 6 months later, Scarlett stood in front of a class of fighter pilots at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, home of the Fighter Weapons School. At 25, she was the youngest instructor in the school's history, and every seat in her classroom was filled with experienced pilots eager to learn from the pilot who'd become a legend. "Today we're going to talk about decision-making in fluid combat situations," she began. 6 months ago, my squadron was ambushed over the Black Sea. 4 F-15s against 10 enemy fighters. They had surprise, superior numbers, good tactics, and experienced pilots. By every measure, they should have won. She clicked to the next slide, showing the tactical situation. But they made one mistake. They assumed the high-altitude CAP aircraft, my F-22, was just routine presence patrol. They assumed I was inexperienced because I was young. They assumed I would follow doctrine and wait for instructions. Another slide. Gun camera footage of her first missile kill. I didn't wait. I assessed the situation, made a decision, and executed. And in 12 minutes, I changed a losing situation into a victory. But here's what's important. That decision wasn't reckless or impulsive. It was based on years of training, thousands of hours of practice, and a clear understanding of my aircraft's capabilities and my own skills. She looked at her students, experienced pilots, most of them older than her, some with combat experience, all of them here because they wanted to be the best. The lesson isn't that you should be reckless or ignore orders. The lesson is that when lives are on the line, you need to trust your training, trust your instincts, and be willing to act decisively even when it's not what people expect from you. But that trust has to be earned through preparation. You can't be decisive in the moment if you haven't done the work beforehand. One of the students raised his hand. Lieutenant Hayes, the maneuvers in that footage, the Herbst, the post-stall pointing, the high G sustained turns, those aren't standard tactical moves. Where should we learn those? Scarlett smiled. They're not standard because most pilots never need them. But when you do need them, they can mean the difference between life and death. If you want to learn them, there are aerobatic schools all over the world. Spend your leave time learning to push your aircraft to its limits in controlled environments. So when you need those skills in combat, they're already programmed into your muscle memory. That's what I did. Every summer from age 16 to 20, I spent my time at aerobatic schools, learning to fly aircraft at the edge of their performance envelope. It wasn't about showing off. It was about understanding what an aircraft could do and what I could do, so that when I needed that knowledge, it was already there. Another student spoke up. "Ma'am, some of us are concerned about the age thing. You're 25 and already an instructor here. Some of us have been flying for 10 years and are just getting to weapons school. How do we reconcile that?" Scarlett nodded, appreciating the honest question. "That's a fair concern. Here's what I'd say. Age and calendar time don't equal expertise. Quality of training and intensity of practice matter more than years of doing something. I had advantages. A father who was an expert pilot, access to high-quality civilian training, the drive to compete internationally. That gave me thousands of hours of high-intensity practice before I ever put on a uniform. Your path might be different, but the principle is the same. It's not about how long you've been flying. It's about how intentionally you've been improving. Every flight can be a learning opportunity if you approach it that way. Every debrief can make you better if you're honest about your mistakes. Every sim session can build skills if you challenge yourself. Focus on being better today than yesterday, and the rest will follow." A third student raised her hand. "Lieutenant Hayes, what about the emotional side? You watched Lieutenant Jackson die. You knew Captain Mitchell might die if you didn't act fast enough. How did you manage that emotional pressure while executing at such a high level?" Scarlett paused, considering the question carefully. It was one she'd asked herself many times in the months since the engagement. "Honestly, in the moment, I didn't have time to process emotion. I was operating on training and instinct. The emotional impact came later, after we landed, during the memorial service, in quiet moments when I had time to think about what happened." She took a breath. "The truth is, being a fighter pilot means accepting that you might have to watch friends die, that you might die yourself, that split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death. You can't let that paralyze you. You train so hard that when the moment comes, your body and mind know what to do even when your emotions are screaming. You process the trauma later, with help if you need it. But in the moment, you have to be able to compartmentalize and focus on the mission, on saving who you can save, Years later, after Scarlett had moved from fighter weapons school to operational squadrons to test pilot school to eventually command her own fighter wing, students would still study that 12-minute engagement over the Black Sea. The tactical decisions, the maneuvers, the ruthless efficiency with which she dismantled a numerically superior force. It became required viewing at every fighter weapons school in NATO, dissected and analyzed, used as the gold standard for single-pilot combat effectiveness. But the real lesson wasn't about the tactics or the flying. The real lesson was that nobody knew who Scarlett Hayes really was until the moment demanded she reveal it. She'd kept her capabilities quiet, had been underestimated and overlooked, had let people assume she was just another young pilot learning the job. And then, when her squadron was dying in the sky and every second counted, she'd shown them all what a pilot could do when training, skill, and determination came together at the critical moment. She hadn't needed recognition or respect before that moment. She just needed to be ready when the moment came. And she had been. The ambush over the Black Sea had been designed to destroy an American fighter squadron. Instead, it had revealed one of the most naturally talented fighter pilots of her generation, someone who'd been preparing her entire life without knowing exactly what she was preparing for. Someone who proved that being underestimated wasn't a weakness. It was an advantage, as long as you were ready to show who you really were when it mattered most. Her father would have been proud. Thanks for watching. Every woman has a story worth telling. Join us to hear them all.